I'll bet $100,000 she can't say a single sentence in Chinese. The laughter arrived before the words had even settled across the crystal glasses. It rolled beneath the glittering chandeliers of the Imperial Crest Hotel in downtown Seattle, where every polished marble floor reflected power, wealth, and the quiet confidence of people who believed they had already seen everything worth seeing. Investors from New York exchanged smiles with executives from Silicon Valley, while distinguished guests from Beijing and Shanghai took their seats around a table prepared for what many were already calling the business dinner of the year. At the center of the room stood Ethan Carter, the 39-year-old billionaire CEO of Carter Global Holdings, a man whose reputation had been built on billion-dollar negotiations and fearless decisions. His tailored navy suit fit with effortless precision. His silver watch caught every warm beam of light, and his easy smile carried the certainty of someone accustomed to winning every room he entered. Tonight was supposed to be another victory, another international partnership that would expand his company's reach across Asia. Instead, one quiet moment would begin rewriting everything he believed about the people standing only a few feet away. Near the edge of the private dining room, Naomi Brooks moved silently between the tables with a porcelain teapot balanced gracefully in her hands. At 26, she had mastered the invisible rhythm expected of every server in an elite restaurant. Refill the tea before anyone noticed it was low. Replace a folded napkin before someone asked. Step forward without interrupting. Step away before anyone remembered your face. Most guests barely looked at her. Some nodded politely. Others never lifted their eyes from their phones or their conversations. To them, she blended perfectly into the expensive furniture, another quiet detail that completed an evening designed for people whose names appeared on magazine covers. Ethan watched one of the visiting executives whisper something in Mandarin before glancing toward Naomi with an amused grin. The interpreter seated nearby chuckled softly, and Ethan leaned back in his chair, clearly entertained by whatever private joke had just crossed the table. Go ahead, he said confidently. She won't understand a word. Another round of laughter spread across the room. Someone suggested making it interesting. Someone else joked that even recognizing the language would be impressive. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and casually placed a personal check on the polished walnut table. $100,000, he announced with the relaxed confidence of a man placing a friendly wager at a golf club. If she can answer in fluent Chinese, it's hers. Several guests smiled. A few exchanged uncertain glances. Others simply assumed the evening had found its entertainment. Naomi continued pouring tea without changing her expression. Her hands remained perfectly steady. She thanked each guest in calm English, her voice soft enough to disappear beneath the conversations flowing around her. If she had heard the challenge, she gave no sign. The visiting executives switched completely into Mandarin, their discussion becoming faster, more natural, filled with subtle humor and cultural references that seemed far beyond the reach of anyone outside their circle. Ethan folded his arms with quiet satisfaction. He believed the bet had already been won. After all, the room itself seemed to support his certainty. Wealth sat at every chair. Influence filled every conversation. Expensive suits carried more authority than uniforms ever could. Or so everyone assumed. What no one noticed was the brief pause in Naomi's movement as she gently placed the final teacup onto its saucer. It lasted less than a heartbeat, almost impossible to see. Her eyes lifted for only a moment, meeting the reflection of the room in the polished silver serving tray she carried. Calm, patient, completely composed. She wasn't listening because she was curious. She was listening because every single word mattered. And somewhere between the confident laughter, the expensive promises, and the certainty that intelligence always wore a tailored suit, the evening quietly crossed an invisible line that no amount of money would ever erase. Naomi Brooks had learned years ago that the people who underestimated her often revealed far more about themselves than they ever intended. Every smile that carried quiet arrogance, every conversation spoken as though she did not exist, every assumption wrapped inside polished manners had become part of the background music of places like the Imperial Crest Hotel. She never interrupted. She never corrected anyone. She simply observed. Her shift had started 6 hours earlier, long before the first limousine stopped beneath the glowing entrance. While guests adjusted designer jackets and discussed quarterly earnings, Naomi had been arranging fine china, polishing silverware until it reflected the ceiling lights like mirrors, and memorizing every seating assignment for the evening. Excellence had become her habit because it was the only standard she accepted from herself, even when nobody noticed. The private dining room continued humming with confidence as conversations drifted effortlessly between investment strategies, technology forecasts, and international expansion. Waiters moved quietly through the room with practiced precision, but Naomi remained unusually aware of the discussion taking place at Ethan Carter's table. The executives visiting from China had relaxed considerably after the first course arrived. Their formal smiles had become genuine laughter, and the rapid rhythm of Mandarin now flowed naturally across the table. Ethan watched them with confidence, occasionally looking toward the interpreter whenever clarification seemed necessary. He believed everything remained comfortably under control. After all, that was the environment where he had built his career. Numbers made sense. Negotiations followed predictable patterns. Influence solved problems before they became obstacles. Yet the atmosphere shifted almost invisibly when one senior executive from Shanghai lowered his voice and asked a thoughtful question in Mandarin that lasted much longer than the interpreter expected. The interpreter hesitated for only a fraction of a second before offering a brief English summary that sounded noticeably shorter than the original conversation. Ethan nodded without concern. The other American executives accepted the translation immediately. Naomi did not react outwardly, but something behind her calm expression quietly changed. She continued serving fresh tea, her movements smooth and measured, while listening carefully to every word that crossed the room. She noticed polite expressions hiding genuine uncertainty. She noticed subtle pauses that suggested ideas were being softened rather than accurately translated. Most importantly, she noticed that one phrase concerning future licensing rights had disappeared entirely from the English version. It was not an obvious mistake. It was the kind of omission that could quietly reshape the meaning of an entire agreement without anyone recognizing it until months later. Naomi gently placed another porcelain cup before one of the guests, offering a courteous smile before stepping back exactly as her training required. Across the table, Ethan remained focused on building rapport, unaware that the conversation had already begun moving in a direction different from the one he believed. The Chinese executives exchanged thoughtful glances with one another, clearly expecting a response to a point that had never actually reached the American side of the table. The silence lasted only a few seconds, yet it carried unexpected weight. One executive adjusted his glasses. Another looked politely toward the interpreter. Ethan answered confidently based on the information he had received, and although his words sounded perfectly reasonable, they did not fully address the concern that had just been raised. A subtle change appeared around the table. Smiles became smaller. Several guests leaned back quietly. No one challenged Ethan directly because courtesy remained deeply important to everyone present, but the energy in the room no longer felt effortless. Naomi recognized that look immediately. It was the expression people wore when respect encouraged silence, even though misunderstanding continued growing beneath the surface. She looked once toward the elegant windows overlooking Seattle's evening skyline, where thousands of city lights shimmered against the dark water beyond Elliott Bay. The reflection reminded her of something her grandfather had once told her many years earlier. Real knowledge never demanded attention. It waited patiently until truth required a voice. She breathed slowly, folded the serving towel neatly across her arm, and returned to the table just as another complicated exchange in Mandarin began, realizing that the next few moments would quietly determine far more than anyone in that remarkable room could possibly imagine. The discussion moved forward with polished smiles, careful handshakes, and expensive confidence, yet the invisible gap between what had been said and what had actually been understood continued growing with every passing minute. Naomi remained only a few steps away, quietly replacing empty teacups with fresh ones while the interpreter summarized another long exchange into a few comfortable English sentences. To nearly everyone in the room, the evening still appeared flawless. Crystal glasses reflected the golden lights above. Gentle piano music drifted through the hotel from somewhere beyond the private dining room. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Seattle shimmered beneath a cool evening sky, the city looking peaceful enough to convince anyone that nothing unexpected could possibly happen tonight. But appearances had a way of protecting the wrong assumptions. One of the senior executives from Beijing leaned forward and spoke with measured confidence, his Mandarin precise and deliberate. He explained that their board had one final concern before approving the partnership. They admired Carter Global Holdings and respected Ethan's reputation, but they wanted reassurance that future technology developed jointly would remain protected under a specific intellectual property structure unique to Chinese regulatory requirements. The interpreter smiled politely before offering a noticeably shorter explanation in English, reducing a detailed concern into little more than a general question about future cooperation. Ethan answered immediately, speaking with the calm authority that had earned him international recognition. He promised transparency, flexibility, and mutual trust. His words sounded impressive, earning approving nods from several American executives seated nearby. Yet the Chinese delegation remained unusually quiet. Their expressions stayed courteous, but something essential had been left unresolved. Naomi noticed one executive glance discreetly toward another before quietly setting down his chopsticks. Another folded his hands together and lowered his eyes, not in agreement, but in careful reflection. Years of observing people had taught Naomi that silence often carried more meaning than applause. She could almost feel uncertainty spreading beneath the elegant surface of the dinner. The interpreter continued confidently, unaware that his shortened explanations had gradually shifted the direction of the conversation away from its original purpose. Ethan never questioned him because there had never been a reason to doubt the professional sitting beside him. Trust was natural in rooms like this. Expertise was assumed. Credentials spoke loudly. Uniforms, on the other hand, rarely did. Naomi gently placed a fresh pot of jasmine tea near the visiting guests, her movements as graceful as ever. One executive thanked her in Mandarin without expecting a response. She offered only a respectful smile and a slight nod before stepping back once again. The simple gesture went unnoticed by nearly everyone except the elderly chairman seated near the center of the delegation. His eyes lingered on Naomi for a brief moment, almost as if he sensed something unusual behind her calm composure. Across the table, Ethan reached for the agreement prepared by his legal team. The documents represented nearly 18 months of negotiations and countless hours of planning. Everyone understood the significance of the signatures waiting at the end of the evening. Millions of dollars, thousands of future jobs, and years of international cooperation depended upon what happened inside this room before dessert was served. The chairman quietly asked another question in Mandarin, this time even more specific than before. He referred directly to a licensing provision found several pages inside the contract and asked whether Carter Global Holdings intended to modify the ownership language after the first production cycle. Once again, the interpreter condensed the explanation into something far simpler than the original statement. Ethan answered with complete confidence, unaware that he had unintentionally confirmed a position different from the one the delegation had actually proposed. A subtle wave of disappointment crossed several faces around the table. No voices rose. No arguments followed. The room simply became quieter. Naomi lowered her eyes for a brief second, feeling the weight of every word that had disappeared between two languages. She understood exactly where the misunderstanding had begun, exactly why the visiting executives were becoming hesitant, and exactly how easily the entire evening could end with polite smiles hiding irreversible disappointment. She also understood something else. Sometimes the smallest voice in the room carried the only words capable of preventing the biggest mistake. Naomi stood perfectly still, the silver tray resting lightly against her forearm as another quiet exchange unfolded across the table. No one noticed that her breathing had slowed. No one noticed that every sentence spoken in Mandarin reached her with complete clarity. Years of discipline had taught her that knowledge meant very little without timing. Speaking too early could embarrass someone. Speaking too late could cost everyone far more than money. Around the polished walnut table, confidence continued disguising itself as certainty. Ethan Carter smiled politely as he reviewed another page of the agreement, occasionally thanking the interpreter for his assistance. Across from him, Chairman Liu carefully removed his reading glasses and placed them beside the contract. His expression remained gracious, but his colleagues had grown noticeably quieter. They were no longer evaluating numbers. They were evaluating trust. The interpreter continued summarizing detailed discussions into short, comfortable explanations, never realizing that each omission was widening the distance between both sides of the negotiation. One executive from Shenzhen asked whether Carter Global Holdings intended to preserve the original wording regarding regional patent ownership during future expansion into Asian markets. The question was thoughtful, precise, and central to the partnership. Yet the English version that reached Ethan became little more than a general inquiry about future cooperation. Ethan answered warmly, speaking about shared growth, innovation, and long-term friendship between both companies. His response sounded impressive to everyone who depended on English. To everyone listening in Mandarin, however, it quietly missed the point. Chairman Liu lowered his eyes toward the contract without saying another word. A younger executive beside him gently closed his notebook. Another reached for his teacup, but never took a sip. The room remained respectful, but optimism had begun slipping away one silent gesture at a time. Naomi recognized every signal. Respect rarely announced disappointment aloud. It simply became quieter. She placed another cup of jasmine tea before Chairman Liu with the same graceful professionalism she had shown throughout the evening. As she stepped back, she heard him speak softly to the executive beside him in flawless Mandarin. Perhaps our expectations were not understood after all. The sentence was calm. There was no frustration, no accusation, only disappointment wrapped in extraordinary courtesy. Naomi felt the words settle heavily inside her. She also heard the executive answer, just as quietly. It is unfortunate. I believe they valued the details as much as we do. The interpreter had not translated either remark. Ethan remained focused on the agreement, completely unaware that the conversation had already begun drifting toward an ending no one on his team intended. Several American executives continued smiling confidently, believing the signatures were only minutes away. One even whispered that the evening had gone better than expected. Naomi looked around the room for a brief moment. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead. The skyline beyond the windows glowed against the dark waters of Elliott Bay. Expensive watches reflected the warm lighting, while quiet confidence filled every corner of the private dining room. Yet beneath all that elegance, one simple misunderstanding threatened months of preparation. She thought about remaining silent. It would certainly be easier. She was a server, not a consultant. Her responsibility ended with warm tea, clean plates, and attentive service. No one had invited her into the negotiation. No one expected her opinion. Then her eyes fell briefly upon the personal check still resting beside Ethan's place setting. $100,000. The wager that had entertained the room now seemed strangely insignificant compared to what everyone truly stood to lose. Naomi remembered something her grandmother had repeated throughout her childhood. Respect another person's place, but never allow truth to disappear simply because your own place seems small. She gently placed the empty teapot onto her tray, squared her shoulders almost imperceptibly, and waited for the next pause in the conversation. The room grew unusually still as Chairman Liu prepared to close the contract folder without reaching for the signature page. Ethan finally noticed the subtle hesitation spreading across the delegation, though he could not understand its cause. Before another carefully translated summary could carry the discussion even farther from its meaning, Naomi took one calm step forward, her expression composed, her voice respectful, and with complete humility, she prepared to say the first sentence that would change the entire evening. The room remained suspended in an almost perfect silence. It was not the comfortable silence of successful negotiations. It was the uneasy kind that appeared when intelligent people sensed something was wrong, but could not yet explain why. Naomi waited until Chairman Liu gently closed the contract folder halfway. Then she spoke with the same calm tone she had used all evening while greeting guests. "Excuse me, sir." Her voice was soft enough that no one felt interrupted, yet clear enough that every conversation around the table stopped immediately. Ethan looked toward her with mild surprise, clearly expecting a question about tea or dessert. Instead, Naomi turned respectfully toward Chairman Liu and addressed him in fluent Mandarin. "Please forgive me for speaking out of turn. I believe there has been an unintended misunderstanding during the translation, and I would hate to see such an important partnership end because of missing details." The effect was immediate. Chairman Lu's eyes widened. The executive beside him slowly lowered his pen onto the table. Another guest blinked twice as though he had misheard what was happening. Even the interpreter turned toward Naomi, unable to hide his astonishment. Ethan stared silently, his confident smile fading into genuine confusion. Only minutes earlier he had joked that she could not speak a single sentence. Now every syllable she spoke carried the natural rhythm, pronunciation, and quiet confidence of someone who understood not only the language, but also the culture behind it. Chairman Lu answered her in Mandarin, his voice measured but curious. You understood everything we discussed? Naomi nodded politely. Yes, sir. I have been careful not to intrude, but I also understood the concern regarding regional patent ownership and the licensing language after the first production cycle. Another silence swept across the room, heavier than the first. Naomi continued with complete respect, never raising her voice, never attempting to embarrass anyone. Mr. Carter has been responding sincerely to the translated questions. However, several important details have been shortened. His answers reflect what he heard, not necessarily what your delegation intended to ask. Chairman Lu looked thoughtfully toward Ethan before asking Naomi another question in Mandarin. Then would you be willing to explain our concern exactly as we presented it? Naomi inclined her head. Of course. She translated every sentence carefully into English without adding or removing a single idea. She explained that the delegation was not questioning trust or cooperation. They simply wanted written assurance that jointly developed technologies would preserve clearly defined ownership protections under the regulatory framework governing future operations in China. Every clause mattered because precision represented respect. As Naomi spoke, Ethan's expression slowly changed. The confidence that had filled his face earlier gave way to careful concentration. For the first time that evening, he realized the discussion he believed he had been leading was not the discussion the visiting executives had actually been having. He glanced toward the interpreter, who looked equally unsettled, clearly recognizing that several important nuances had indeed been lost along the way. Ethan turned back toward Naomi. Is that really what they have been asking all along? Naomi answered with quiet professionalism. Yes, sir. They have been remarkably patient because they believe the misunderstanding was unintentional. Chairman Lu smiled for the first time since opening the contract. This time his smile reached his eyes. Looking directly at Ethan, he spoke again in Mandarin. Before anyone else could react, Naomi translated every word naturally. Chairman Lu says that true partnerships begin when people care enough to understand one another completely. No one laughed now. No one looked toward the wager resting beside Ethan's plate. Every executive around the table watched the young waitress standing calmly between two worlds that only moments earlier had seemed impossible to bridge. She had not spoken to prove anyone wrong. She had spoken because accuracy mattered, respect mattered, and opportunities built over months deserved better than assumptions built in seconds. For the first time that evening, the room no longer saw a waitress serving tea. They saw the one person who had quietly protected the future of everyone sitting at that table. No one reached for a glass. No one glanced at a phone. Even the soft piano music drifting in from the hotel lounge seemed to disappear beneath the weight of what had just unfolded. Ethan Carter looked at the contract in front of him as though he were seeing it for the first time. Throughout his career, he had believed that every successful negotiation depended on preparation, strategy, and confidence. Tonight, he had just discovered that another ingredient mattered every bit as much. Understanding. He slowly closed the folder and turned toward Chairman Lu with complete sincerity. Thank you for your patience, he said. I now realize that I have been answering questions that were never actually asked. That is my responsibility, and I would like the opportunity to begin again. Naomi translated his words into fluent Mandarin without changing either the meaning or the humility behind them. Chairman Lu listened carefully before smiling with quiet approval. He answered in Mandarin at a measured pace, and Naomi once again translated every sentence with remarkable precision. Business can recover from honest mistakes, she said. It cannot recover from pride that refuses to recognize them. The atmosphere in the room shifted almost instantly. Shoulders relaxed. Several executives who had remained silent for most of the evening finally leaned forward with renewed interest. What had moments earlier felt like a negotiation approaching failure now felt like the beginning of a genuine conversation. Ethan no longer rushed his responses. After every important question from the delegation, he paused, allowing Naomi to translate both directions with complete accuracy. Rather than dominating the discussion, he listened. Rather than assuming, he clarified. The difference became impossible to miss. Questions that had seemed complicated only minutes earlier suddenly produced thoughtful answers, shared laughter, and genuine agreement. One licensing provision was adjusted with only a few carefully chosen words. Another paragraph was rewritten to satisfy both legal teams without changing the spirit of the partnership. Every solution appeared surprisingly simple once everyone truly on. The final signature dried beneath the warm lights of the private dining room, and for several long seconds no one spoke. The agreement that had nearly slipped away now rested safely inside its leather portfolio, carrying with it not only the promise of future success, but also the quiet reminder that understanding had accomplished what confidence alone could not. Chairman Liu carefully closed the folder and looked toward Naomi with an expression that carried genuine respect. Then, without warning, he slowly rose from his chair. The movement immediately caught everyone's attention. One by one, the executives beside him stood as well. There. Chairs moved softly across the polished floor, breaking the silence without disturbing its meaning. Ethan watched with visible surprise as every member of the visiting delegation remained standing, their attention focused not on the billionaire at the head of the table, but on the young waitress holding a silver serving tray. Chairman Liu placed one hand over his heart before speaking in Mandarin. Naomi hesitated for the first time that evening. She understood every word, yet translating them about herself felt strangely uncomfortable. Chairman Liu smiled gently, recognizing her hesitation. "Please," he said. "They deserve to hear this exactly as I have spoken it." Naomi took a quiet breath before translating into English. Chairman Liu says that in business we often celebrate people who close deals, but we rarely recognize the people who make understanding possible. Tonight, he believes the most valuable person in this room was not the one with the highest title, but the one who protected everyone's trust. A deep silence followed her translation. It was the kind of silence that did not come from uncertainty, but from reflection. Several American executives slowly rose from their seats as well. No one had asked them to stand. No announcement had been made. The gesture spread naturally around the table until every person in the room was on their feet. Ethan remained standing beside his chair, looking directly at Naomi with an honesty that had not been present earlier in the evening. The applause began softly. One pair of hands, then another. Within moments, the entire room echoed with warm, sincere appreciation. It was not loud or theatrical. It carried something far more meaningful. Respect freely given. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment, visibly humbled by the unexpected recognition. She offered a small smile and waited patiently until the applause faded. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I only wanted everyone to understand each other." Her simple response somehow made the room even quieter than before. Chairman Liu nodded with admiration. "That," he said through Naomi's own translation, "is precisely why you succeeded." Ethan reached toward the personal check that still rested beside his place setting. He looked at the amount written across the front before holding it gently between his fingers. A faint smile crossed his face, though this one carried none of the confidence that had accompanied the wager earlier in the evening. Instead, it reflected humility earned through experience. Looking directly at Naomi, he said, "I made that bet believing I already knew what you were capable of. Tonight proved that assumptions are far more expensive than $100,000. Around the table, several executives exchanged thoughtful smiles. They had arrived expecting to witness an international business negotiation. Instead, they had watched an unforgettable lesson unfold before their eyes. In a room filled with wealth, influence, and impressive titles, the greatest authority had belonged to the person everyone had overlooked. And long after the contract would be announced in boardrooms and financial headlines, those who attended that dinner would remember something else entirely. They would remember the quiet waitress whose voice never demanded attention, yet changed the course of the entire evening simply by choosing understanding over pride. The applause gradually faded, but the feeling it left behind lingered in the room like the final note of a beautiful melody. Conversations resumed, although they no longer sounded the same. The discussions were warmer, the smiles more genuine, and the invisible distance that had separated the people around the table only an hour earlier had quietly disappeared. Naomi returned to collecting empty teacups with the same calm professionalism she had shown since the beginning of her shift. She did not linger near the center of attention. She did not search for compliments. She simply continued doing her work, believing that one meaningful moment should never become an excuse to forget who you are. Chairman Liu watched her for a moment before quietly approaching Ethan. Speaking in English now, he smiled and said, "The most impressive people are often the ones who never introduce themselves first." Ethan nodded slowly. He understood exactly what the chairman meant. Earlier that evening he had measured value by appearance, position, and assumption. Now he found himself wondering how many remarkable people he had overlooked throughout his career simply because they wore different uniforms. As dessert was served, several members of the Chinese delegation invited Naomi into brief conversations, asking about her pronunciation, her studies, and the places where she had learned Mandarin. She answered every question with humility. She explained that language had fascinated her since childhood because every new language opened the door to another way of seeing the world. She shared that she had spent several years studying alongside professors, native speakers, and cultural mentors who taught her that grammar was only the beginning. True fluency came from learning respect, patience, and curiosity. Chairman Liu smiled with unmistakable pride. "That is why your words carried trust," he said. "People can memorize vocabulary, but sincerity cannot be memorized." Nearby, Ethan listened quietly. He noticed that Naomi never mentioned awards, certificates, or personal sacrifices. She spoke only about gratitude toward the people who had helped her learn. That humility impressed him even more than her remarkable command of the language. Eventually, Ethan walked toward her, holding the personal check he had written earlier that evening. This time, there was no audience waiting for entertainment, only a few nearby guests continuing relaxed conversations. He extended the check toward Naomi. "A promise should remain a promise," he said sincerely. Naomi looked at the check before gently shaking her head. "Thank you, Mr. Carter, but I cannot accept it." Ethan looked surprised. "You earned it." Naomi smiled kindly. "The bet was based on an assumption. I do not want to be rewarded for proving someone wrong. I would rather remember tonight because people finally understood one another." Her answer left Ethan speechless for a brief moment. Slowly, he folded the check and returned it to his jacket pocket. Then he offered something far more valuable than money. "Would you allow me to ask one favor instead?" Naomi looked at him with quiet curiosity. "The next time my company prepares for an international partnership, I hope you will agree to sit at the table before the meeting begins instead of serving beside it." Naomi gave a modest smile, clearly touched but still composed. "If I can help people understand one another," she replied, "I would be honored." Chairman Liu overheard the exchange and laughed softly. "Now," he said warmly, "that sounds like the beginning of the smartest investment made all evening." Around them, the final conversations of the night continued beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers. But the true success of the evening could no longer be measured by signatures, valuations, or future profits. It had become something far simpler and far more enduring. A room full of influential people had arrived expecting to negotiate a business agreement. They were leaving with a lesson they would carry long after the contract itself became yesterday's news. The last guests slowly made their way toward the elevators, their conversations softer than when the evening had begun. Outside, the lights of Seattle shimmered across Elliott Bay, reflecting against the glass walls of the Imperial Crest Hotel like quiet reminders that every city carried thousands of stories hidden behind ordinary faces. Inside the private dining room, the staff began clearing crystal glasses and neatly folding linen napkins, restoring the room to the elegant calm it had known before the dinner started. Naomi Brooks picked up the final serving tray with the same quiet grace she had carried throughout the evening. Nothing about her posture suggested that she had just changed the outcome of one of the most important business negotiations of the year. To anyone walking in now, she looked exactly like every other dedicated professional finishing a long shift. Ethan Carter remained behind for a few extra minutes after everyone else had left. He looked around the now empty room and realized how different it felt from only a few hours earlier. Earlier that evening, he had believed leadership meant having the loudest voice, the strongest reputation, and the greatest confidence. Tonight had quietly rewritten that belief. Leadership also meant listening. Before assuming, asking before judging, and recognizing value before titles introduced it. As Naomi prepared to leave, Ethan approached her one final time. His expression carried none of the effortless certainty that had defined him at the beginning of the night. Instead, it reflected something much rarer. Growth. "Ms. Brooks," he said sincerely, "I hope you will accept my apology. Not because I underestimated your language skills, but because I underestimated you." Naomi met his eyes and offered a warm, understanding smile. "Everyone makes assumptions sometimes," she replied gently. "What matters is what we choose to do after we recognize them." Ethan nodded slowly. Those words stayed with him longer than any business advice he had ever received. Chairman Liu, preparing to depart with the rest of his delegation, paused beside them and smiled. "The strongest bridges are not built from steel," he said thoughtfully. "They are built from respect." Naomi translated his words instinctively, although everyone seemed to understand their meaning long before the English reached the room. Chairman Liu extended his hand first to Ethan, then respectfully to Naomi. "I look forward to many successful years together," he said. "Because tonight we signed more than a contract. We built trust." The delegation departed, leaving behind nothing except quiet footsteps and lasting impressions. Weeks later, news of the international partnership would appear across business publications throughout the United States and overseas. Analysts would discuss market growth, innovation, and projected revenue. They would study financial charts, interview executives, and praise the strategic vision behind the agreement. Yet none of those headlines would capture the most important moment of that evening. The real turning point had not happened when the contracts were signed. It had happened when one person chose understanding over silence, humility over recognition, and truth over convenience. Ethan would eventually introduce new leadership training inside his company, reminding every executive that talent could never be measured by appearance alone. Chairman Liu would often tell young entrepreneurs about the unforgettable dinner in Seattle where dignity quietly rescued a partnership. And Naomi would return to work the very next day with the same calm smile, greeting every guest with equal kindness because she had never been searching for applause. She had simply been living according to the values that had shaped her long before anyone noticed. Some people leave a room remembered because they demanded attention. Others leave remembered because they changed the way everyone else sees the world. That evening, wealth filled the room, influence surrounded the table, and powerful names appeared on every place card. But the greatest lesson came from the quietest voice. Intelligence never needed permission to speak. Character never depended on a job title. And respect, once freely given, became the only investment that continued growing long after every signature had dried.